projects, but this time in Chile.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So, good afternoon. So I'm going to be presenting a preliminary work of a PhD student, that is Rodrigo Herrera, who's working with Luis Alarcón, myself. And so this data, it's still going on. This is the first part of the work, but it's very promising. So basically what we're going to be doing is assessment or trying to understand the relation between some lean practices, performance of the design teams, and through, let's say, the social network analysis. In particular here, we are focusing on airport projects in Chile. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem, just to motivate, and then a little bit of background on the different topics that are relevant, of course, for this problem. And then we're going to discuss the research methodology and the results and conclusions. So, too many animations. So basically, projects are getting complex. Airport projects are one example of it. Hospitals, IT, buildings, etc. They're getting each time more complex. But besides the complexity of the projects themselves, the organizations that are designing and building those projects are also getting more complex. So, in particular, we're interested in the design phase, since, as we all know, it's a phase where we have very big opportunity to produce impacts in the project and a very low cost of making changes. So that's a particularly important phase where we should be focusing. So we need to understand what's going on here. So with that, the purpose of this first part of the research is to understand the functioning and the performance of these temporary organizations that are designing the airport projects. And in this case, we are differentiating between projects at the preliminary design phase, and the final detailed design phase. And regarding the functioning, we are worried about lean practices, what level of implementation or use of these lean practices have the organizations, and the interaction that happen between the stakeholders from the design phase. And of course, for the performance, we're going to use some KPIs. So in the work that we're doing now, the continuation of this work, we're also adding here BIM uses. So we're trying to understand what happens with the interaction of teams that are using BIM, using Lean, using both together, or none at all. So a little bit of background. There has been already evidence that the use of Last Planet and other Lean practices have a good impact in the design phase. And we were able to collect a lot of those practices, and we organized them in those 4 categories that are there: the stakeholder management, planning and monitoring, problem solving, and decision making. In terms of the interaction of the organization, the interaction between the professionals in these temporary organizations is fundamental for the project success. So it's very important how they interact between each other. And recently, this new technique of, well, relatively new technique of social network analysis has been using. We have had a couple of presentations already here in this conference and in previous conference too. So it's something that every time we see more frequently. And it's a good way to, as you see, to understand the role of these informal structures in the projects. The different networks, we can use different networks to measure different things. So for example, there are some networks that are able to measure the level of interaction in general, like all the types of interaction that happen in between the stakeholders, the trust, how much you trust to each one of the members, well, not how much, if you trust them or not, it's binary, the workflow of information, and for example, planning. Who do I meet to plan the work? So you could use different types of networks. And these networks, each of those networks, we can measure them with different indicators. One of the indicators that we're using, actually the most important one that we're using now, is the density. But also we have diameter of the network, the path length to communicate between one another. This morning we saw a presentation that explained some of these indicators with more detail. In terms of the KPIs, there is a lot of research about the KPIs in construction phase and a little bit less in design phase, but anyway, there are some indicators that are relevant, and we identify some that are related to productivity metrics and also to quality in terms of design. Remember, we're always in design phase. So what we did, we took 9 non-concession airport projects in Chile, and we identified with this group of stakeholders, the client, that's the organization that manage the projects in Chile as part of the Public Works Ministry, then the designers, the design team, and the users. There's also a government organization, different from this one, that manage the projects when they're already built. Oops. There you go. So we had these 9 projects. 5 of them were in the preliminary design phase and 4 of them in the detail phase. And what we did is that we assess the lean practices, the performance, and the interaction between the stakeholders. The lean practices, we did it through interviews. So Rodrigo interviewed the stakeholders, and based on their responses, Rodrigo itself was the one that assessed their answers for the lean practices between 1 to 5. And the performance indicators, we use these 4 indicators: the rework, the waiting times in the design process, the quality defects, measured during the design, not in the construction, and the commitment achievement. And regarding the interaction assessment, we use an online survey to measure these social networks, basically the networks that are there. The knowledge of the roles, how much do I know, what the other people are doing, the interaction between, the global interaction, any type of interaction, the work information flows, the planning and problem solving, learning, and trust. So here are all the lean practices that are grouped in these 4 categories that I explained before: stakeholder management, planning, monitoring, problem solving, and decision making. And here are the results of the level of use of those practices by in all these projects. You see the median, the red one is for the preliminary design phase, and the orange for the final. You see that they are very similar, but there is, especially in the practice number 1, there is the involvement of the designers in early phases of the project. You have that there is a bigger difference between those 2 phases. But in general, they are very similar. There are some also differences here. And you see that the practices that in general are more used in these projects are the involvement of the designers in early phases, the management of the requirements, the participation of the client during the design phase, and the activities and milestones that are pulling the work. And the list use are over there. I'm not going to go into the details because we don't have too much time. So in terms of the social network analysis, this is just an example for one of the companies, for one of the projects. Here you see 3 networks where the blue dots are client stakeholders, green dots are the user, not too many, just those, and the red or orange dots are the designers. And what you're seeing there are the connections. So basically saying that this user, he knows or she knows the role of only these 2 persons. He doesn't know the role of any of the other ones. That's basically what they're saying. And actually, he just knows the role of that person because the line is green because it's coming out of the green dot. And this line is blue because it's coming out of this kind of blue dot. So basically this guy knows what this guy does, but this guy doesn't know what the other guy does. So they are reciprocal. Oh, thanks. And one thing that is interesting also to see is that the learning network is a subset of the trust. So we learn from the people that we trust. Another thing interesting to see is that usually the role is very similar to the interaction networks, basically because we need to know what people does in order to interact with them. Here it's basically the same data but arranged in a different way, just to show the differences. And you can see that in most of the cases, the density, these are the densities for the different networks. In the preliminary phase, they are higher than in the final detail phase. These are the results of KPIs, and as you see, they are pretty bad. Like rework, well, is about 20%, even higher in the case of the preliminary phase. The commitment achievement is relatively high, the mean is 75%. And then we have waiting times and quality defects that are relatively high. So finally, we try to find a correlation between these different factors. I know that that's a lot of information and we don't have the time to go through it. But anyway, I want to just to point it out, some interesting findings. So maybe it would be expected, but between the networks, interaction networks, the blue ones or the cyan, there is a high correlation. So the darkest the color is the higher the darkest the correlation. The green ones are direct correlation. The red ones are indirect correlation. So you see, oops, they are very well correlated between them, which is to be expected. But here there is something that was like we were not expecting. Like the practice of problem solving is negatively related with the interaction. So the more you interact, the less application of problem solving practices you have. So that was kind of hard to understand at the beginning. We have some theories about it, but I'll say in the conclusions. Also, we have some weird things here, like the time is going directly proportionally with the decision making. So if we have practices of decision making, our our waiting time increases. So maybe because we have a more formal process. So the conclusions, lean practices, well, can be grouped in those 4 categories that we propose. We identify the lean practices with the highest presence, where those, I'm going to skip the less relevant ones. Density indicators of interaction are lower in the projects in the detail phase compared with the preliminary phase of design. We found out that this relation of the knowledge of the role was very important for the interaction, so we're saying that the kickoff meetings are very essential for the projects because that's an opportunity where everyone can really understand what the other one does, so then they can interact. So that's why it's an important conclusion. And sorry, the low levels of interaction can explain a little bit some of the KPIs, you know, so the rework that we had, the 20% and the design quality errors. And most of the projects had a low level of implementation lean practices, and the connection, we think that the connections are not entirely valid, the correlations that we found, because the level of implementation was relatively low and with a low dispersion. So that means that we could not find very good correlations between them when we did the statistical analysis. And in general, the correlations were relatively weak, and the waiting time, the latencies are longer when the stakeholder management and the decision practices increase. which was also a little bit unexpected. And finally, the problem-solving practices negatively affects or correlates with the interaction metrics, what I said before. We think that one of the reasons for that could be that. Oh, that's my timer. Thank you. So, just to wrap up. We found very interesting, some intriguing results, but also at the same time, we think that the approach that we follow is very powerful to do this kind of analysis. Now we need to have more data and to repeat the analysis with other projects. So, thank you very much.